Okay, I have to say the room is much bigger than I expected. So, okay, the article is about overseas Chinese, or nowadays more about Chinese overseas, or obviously Chinese diaspora. Why I chose these topics when I was doing my MA? I read many books about overseas Chinese. It seems that overseas Chinese were only doing business or something connected with political issues. Business is everything. Nowadays, even when talk about Chinese diaspora, what came to our mind is Chinatown shops and business. Later, of course, it's connected to political issue as well, because when China was modernized, overseas Chinese really contributed a lot in financial issue, but actually it also promoted the political movements in China in early 20th century. However, the culture aspect, even up to now, is sort of neglected. Maybe the literature was mentioned. We know some Malayan Chinese literature, but it's very limited and it's not really aroused many important focus or attention from various in academia. Not to mention arts. It seems that, okay, it's a cultural desert among overseas Chinese, especially in Southeast Asia. Now we talk about ethnic Chinese. We don't talk about overseas Chinese anymore or Chinese diaspora. It's more like ethnic ones, but still maybe we talk about culture, identity now. But arts, especially visual arts, are a blank. That's why when I was in Singapore, actually after the MA I moved to Singapore, I realized that Singapore somehow they emphasize about the pictures, about the paintings called Nanyang art. These Nanyang artists are all Chinese overseas. Now we see them Chinese overseas, and the paintings, the contents somehow it's a combination. So they promote it's more like a national level. They promote this art to national level. It's more already beyond the aesthetic value. Okay, and I chose Liu Kang because he was promoted sort of like a cultural icon of Singapore. Well, why these people were chosen and what's the characteristic of his paintings or this, okay, see whether it has any relations affected with the Singapore nation building process.
Liu Kang is one of the local artists who helped to develop Singapore's art scene. In 1952, he went to Bali with 3 other local artists in search of a definitive Southeast Asian style. And he came back with a newfound inspiration, a Nanyang art style that influenced many of his later works. And for many art scholars, this was an important milestone in Singapore art's history.
What he learned, in Paris and in our schools in Shanghai and so on, were just his techniques, were just his skills. But the blossoming of his expressions, his art really happened here, in this part of the world, in Singapore. So he is like a window to the kind of cultural development, our kind of cultural identity of Singapore and of the region.
We are small, but we do have a long history. Yet at the same time, we do have people who have contributed in the arts and cultural scene, and they should be honored as we have honored our other leaders, because their contribution matters, not necessarily in the economic sense, but in shaping who we are, our identity as a nation.
So this is a brief introduction. It's an exhibition when the centennial memorial of his art exhibition is held in the biggest art gallery in Singapore, actually it's art museum. It exhibits many of his artworks and almost the important cultural, most important people who is any influenced in cultural atmosphere in Singapore, they all went there. They talk about how important Liu Kang's artworks for the Singapore art history. Why these people? He was actually born in China, Hokkien, Fujian province, which many overseas Chinese came from. but he moved to Malaysia very, very young when he was only 5 years old. But as many overseas Chinese then, he went back to China to receive education. However, not like most overseas Chinese parents expected. He did not become a doctor or lawyer. Instead, he developed his interest in paintings. Then he went to Shanghai. Shanghai for the study of art. This has something quite related to the historical background at that time. First, when in late 19th century, many Chinese went to Southeast Asia. This is Nanyang, we say the South China Sea. But most of them, they only stick to their own dialectic groups. We didn't really have a sense of Chinese at that time. We see dialectic groups, I'm Hokkien, I'm Cantonese, I'm Teochew. It didn't feel any affection at that time about overseas, whether I'm a Chinese. I developed most of the schools were established by the dialectic associations. They have the Teochew school, they have Cantonese school. They didn't really have a Chinese school at first. However, just because of the Sun Yat-sen's national movement, then more and more more and more people came to this place. The scholars, intellectuals, they brought two things. One is a sense of Chinese nationalism. Another is about the Baihua movement. Nowadays we all call Chinese Mandarin, because this Mandarin movement really broke the boundaries among all dialectic groups. The sense of a Chinese nationalism was established then. More and more schools established by teaching Mandarin. So before that, Chinese dialectic groups, they didn't really care about what is happening in China. They only care about their own benefit among their own dialectic groups. But now they move more, they care more about what was happening in China now. The sense of nationalism was aroused. So let's see the culture thing back to that in Singapore or Malaysia at that time. As I mentioned, most overseas Chinese at that time, they care about whether they can make money, whether they could make benefit. Culture, the best things that I can educate my kids is good enough, and it's just very basic education. As long for richer people, they just send back their kids to mainland China for further education. They didn't really trust, or they didn't really sense that, I can receive education here, or some cultural background here. No, it's not important. Liu Kang is just one of these kids who was sent back to China. Interestingly, he developed his interest in arts, which also because China at that time, also after the May 4th movement, the new culture movement, the scholars started to emphasize a more modernized education of all Chinese people, no matter if they are in China, they were in China now, or in Southeast Asia. They emphasize a modernized one. So Western art styles were imported to China. So the new modern art school emphasized on Western painting and Chinese painting were established in China as well. So Liu Kang had this opportunity to study in Shanghai. After that, he felt, maybe it's not enough. He went to Paris as well to study further studies. He spent 5 years there. This experience was quite important to his life as well, not only because of the art education, but also because he literally met many people who later became important to the overseas Chinese art. He met he was there with his master, Liu Haisu. He also met some other artists who later became Nanyang artists as well. Then he went back to China after 5 years study. He thought he could live in Shanghai since then. He really lived a happy life. He started to teach in the Shanghai Academy of Arts. However, something happened in 1937. The Second World War, the Japanese started to invade China in a full-scale style. Shanghai was bombed. Then he had to leave for Singapore again. This experience somehow also related to his art creations, because in his memory, his biography, he said, he left Shanghai in such a hasty that he left most of his artwork at that time in Shanghai. He thought someday he would come back and get them, but in fact he never made it until 21st century. He could not make it anymore. Then he went back to Singapore. Then we could tell that Singapore at that time was not invaded then. However, there's a very big movement that already, that the artists or the scholars, they start to raise funds for the war, for the troops in China. Then, unfortunately, later more things happened. Those people, they came to, the Japanese troops also came to Singapore as well in 1942. And we can see like later, directly after the success of the victory of the Second World War, he painted something about the brutality of the Japanese in Singapore and Malaya as well. This is quite important. This event quite important because at that time, the overseas Chinese, the first time, they really strong has a sense of Chinese identity. Before that, so okay, I don't care what is happening in China, as long as I can live here with a happy life, as long as I could make profit here. However, just because of the Japanese, they sense sort of think that okay, we really need to have a Chinese nationalism. We have a strong nation, then we could have a better life here. Then after everything seemed. But however, after Second World War, things have changed again. First of all, we all know that not long after Second World War, China, the People's Republic of China was established. It's a communist country, which most overseas Chinese were reluctant to going back anymore. Some of them actually they moved to Southeast Asia for temporary. They might just want to avoid the war. But after 1949, they had no choice. They have to live here. Besides to re-identify themselves with the local scene, then they also have to adjust themselves both culturally and other sense. So at that time, there's a recall for the localization of culture of everything else.